The year was 1672 when Moscow's bells rang out across Red Square, announcing the birth of another Romanov prince. Peter Alexeyevich entered the world on June 9th, the son of Tsar Alexis I and his second wife, Natalia Naryshkina. The child arrived into a palace already thick with intrigue, where every smile concealed a dagger and every whisper carried the weight of conspiracy. The Kremlin of Peter's childhood was a labyrinth of ancient towers and golden domes, where Byzantine traditions mingled with Mongol customs and Orthodox prayers echoed through corridors that had witnessed centuries of Russian history. Here, young Peter would take his first steps on marble floors polished by generations of boyars and metropolitans, breathing air heavy with incense and the weight of autocratic power. But even as an infant, Peter seemed restless within these ancient walls. His wet nurses would later recall how the baby prince would crane his neck toward windows, as if searching for something beyond the confines of the palace courtyards. The child who would one day command armies and build cities appeared from his earliest days to be listening for distant sounds, perhaps the whisper of wind across water or the creak of ships' rigging. Peter's father, Tsar Alexis, was a complex ruler caught between the old world and the new. Known for his piety and nicknamed the Quietist, Alexis had nevertheless begun the slow process of modernizing Russia, bringing foreign advisors to court and encouraging trade with Western Europe. The young Peter would absorb these early lessons in the necessity of change, though he would pursue transformation with far greater intensity than his father ever imagined. The death of Tsar Alexis in 1676, when Peter was only 4 years old, plunged the Romanov dynasty into a succession crisis that would define the boy's early years. According to traditional law, the throne should have passed to Alexis's eldest son Ivan, Peter's half-brother from the Tsar's first marriage to Maria Miloslavskaya. But Ivan was sickly and mentally impaired, raising questions about his fitness to rule an increasingly complex empire. The rival court factions that emerged around this succession crisis would shape Peter's understanding of power and politics. The Miloslavsky family, representing the old boyar nobility and traditional Orthodox values, supported Ivan's claim and viewed the Naryshkins with suspicion. The Naryshkin faction, led by Peter's mother and her relatives, advocated for more modern approaches to governance and closer ties with Western Europe. For several years, a delicate balance was maintained with Ivan technically holding the throne, while actual power resided with a regency council. But this arrangement could not last indefinitely, and the tensions between the competing factions continued to build like pressure in a sealed cauldron. The explosion came in 1682 when Peter was 10 years old, in the form of the Streltsy Uprising. The Streltsy were Moscow's traditional military corps, musketeers who served as both royal guards and city police. These bearded warriors, with their colorful uniforms and ancient muskets, represented old Russia in all its conservative glory. They were suspicious of foreign influence, devoted to Orthodox tradition, and increasingly resentful of attempts at military modernization. The uprising began with rumors that the Naryshkins had poisoned Ivan and were planning to eliminate other members of the Miloslavsky family. Whether these accusations contained any truth mattered less than the fact that they provided a spark for accumulated grievances. The Streltsy, supported by conservative boyars and Orthodox clergy, marched on the Kremlin demanding justice. Young Peter witnessed scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life as the Streltsy rampaged through the palace complex. He saw his mother's supporters dragged from their hiding places and thrown from the high red staircase onto the pikes of waiting soldiers. The boy prince watched in horror as men he had known since childhood were torn apart by the mob, their blood staining the ancient stones of the Kremlin courtyards. The trauma of the Streltsy uprising would leave permanent marks on Peter's psyche. He developed a facial tic that would plague him throughout his life, an involuntary spasm that would appear during moments of stress or anger. More importantly, the events of 1682 taught him that traditional military forces could not be trusted, that the old ways of governing Russia were inadequate for the challenges of a changing world. The immediate result of the uprising was the establishment of a dual monarchy, with both Ivan and Peter recognized as co-tsars under the regency of Ivan's sister Sophia. This unusual arrangement reflected the inability of either faction to completely eliminate their rivals, but it also created an unstable situation that could not endure indefinitely. Sophia Alexeyevna was perhaps the most remarkable woman in Russian history to that point, a princess who refused to accept the traditional female role of silent submission. Intelligent, ambitious, and politically astute, she governed Russia effectively for 7 years while the two young tsars grew to maturity. Under her regency, Russia continued the slow process of modernization while maintaining stability at home and abroad. But Sophia's rule also represented everything that Peter would later rebel against. Her government was dominated by traditional boyars who viewed change with suspicion. Her military relied on the same Streltsy who had terrorized his childhood, and her approach to foreign policy remained cautious and conservative. For the young Peter, growing up under Sophia's regency was like being trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but denied the freedom to pursue his true interests. It was during these years of forced idleness that Peter began to develop the obsessions that would define his adult life. Denied real power and excluded from serious governance, he threw himself into military games and technical pursuits with an intensity that alarmed his tutors and courtiers. The village of Preobrazhenskoye, located just outside Moscow, became Peter's refuge and laboratory. Here, away from the stifling protocols of the Kremlin, the young Tsar could indulge his passion for military drill and technical innovation. What began as childhood games gradually evolved into serious military training as Peter recruited boys from the village to serve as his companions and soldiers. These play regiments started as an amusing diversion for a restless prince, but Peter approached them with characteristic intensity. He commissioned real uniforms, acquired genuine weapons, and insisted on proper military discipline. The boys who joined his regiments found themselves subjected to rigorous training that included marching, firearms instruction, and siege warfare tactics. Peter's military games were not mere child's play but rather a rejection of everything the Streltsy represented. Where the traditional Russian military emphasized individual prowess and ancient custom, Peter's regiments stressed discipline, cooperation, and modern techniques. Where the Streltsy clung to outdated weapons and tactics, Peter eagerly experimented with the latest European innovations. The influence of foreign advisors became crucial during these formative years. Moscow's foreign quarter, known as the Nemetskaya Sloboda or German settlement, housed a diverse community of Western Europeans who had come to Russia as merchants, artisans, and military specialists. These foreigners lived according to their own customs, built their own churches, and maintained connections to the broader European world. For the young Peter, the foreign quarter represented everything that traditional Russia was not: modern, efficient, and open to new ideas. He began spending increasing amounts of time there, learning languages, studying technology, and absorbing Western attitudes toward government and society. These experiences planted the seeds of the massive transformation he would later impose on his empire. Among the foreign advisors who influenced Peter's development, none was more important than Franz Lefort, a Swiss mercenary who had entered Russian service during the previous reign. Lefort combined military expertise with social sophistication, and he quickly became Peter's mentor and closest friend. Through Lefort, Peter gained access to European military manuals, technical treatises, and philosophical works that opened his mind to possibilities that traditional Russian education would never have provided. Another crucial figure was Patrick Gordon, a Scottish soldier who had fought across Europe before entering Russian service. Gordon's military experience and technical knowledge made him invaluable to Peter's education, but perhaps more importantly, he represented the international perspective that Peter would later bring to Russian governance. Through Gordon, Peter learned that effective leadership required understanding the broader world beyond Russia's borders. The technical aspects of Peter's education proved equally important. He studied mathematics with intensity unusual for a royal prince, mastering not only basic arithmetic but also geometry, trigonometry, and the practical applications of mathematical knowledge to engineering and artillery. These skills would later prove essential as he supervised the construction of fortifications, ships, and entire cities. Peter's fascination with shipbuilding began during these early years and would remain one of his deepest passions throughout his life. Russia had virtually no naval tradition, despite controlling vast coastlines along the White Sea and the Sea of Azov. The young Tsar seemed to instinctively understand that a great power required naval strength, and he threw himself into learning every aspect of ship construction and seamanship. His first serious encounter with naval technology came through the discovery of an old English boat in a royal storehouse. This vessel, built decades earlier but never used, became Peter's obsession as he worked to understand its construction and operation. With the help of Dutch shipwrights, he learned to sail this craft on local rivers and lakes, developing the skills that would later enable him to navigate the challenging waters of the Baltic and Black Seas. The deeper Peter delved into Western knowledge and technology, the more apparent became the gap between Russia and its European neighbors. This realization was both exciting and troubling, offering glimpses of what Russia might become while highlighting how far the country lagged behind contemporary standards of military and technical achievement. By his late teens, Peter had essentially created a parallel government at Preobrazhenskoye, complete with military units, technical advisors, and administrative structures that operated according to Western principles rather than traditional Russian customs. This shadow state would become the foundation for his later reforms, providing both the institutional framework and the trained personnel necessary for comprehensive transformation. The tension between Peter's modernizing impulses and Sophia's conservative regency could not continue indefinitely. As Peter approached adulthood and began asserting his rights as Khazar, the fundamental incompatibility between their visions for Russia's future became increasingly apparent. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only who would rule Russia but what kind of country Russia would become. Rise to Power and the Great Embassy, 1689 to 1698. The confrontation that would determine Russia's future began not with grand declarations or military parades, but with whispered conversations in monastery cells and midnight meetings in foreign quarters. By 1689, Peter had reached his 17th year, and the fiction of dual monarchy with his half-brother Ivan could no longer disguise the fundamental question facing the Russian Empire. Would it continue along the path of traditional Orthodox conservatism under Sophia's regency, or embrace the radical modernization that Peter represented? The crisis came to a head in August of 1689, triggered by rumors that Sophia was planning to eliminate Peter and rule as empress in her own right. Whether these rumors contained truth or were merely the product of court paranoia mattered less than the fact that they provided a catalyst for forces that had been building for years. Peter, warned by loyal supporters, fled Moscow in the dead of night, riding hard through the forest to reach the sanctuary of the Trinity Monastery of St. Sergius. The monastery that sheltered the young Tsar was itself a symbol of Russian spirituality and resistance. Founded in the 14th century by St. Sergius of Radenez, it had withstood Polish sieges and served as a refuge for previous rulers during times of crisis. Within its massive walls, surrounded by icons and the tombs of saints, Peter made the decision that would define the rest of his reign. He would no longer accept the limitations imposed by traditional Russian governance. From the monastery, Peter issued summons to military commanders, government officials, and foreign advisors, demanding that they choose between loyalty to the regency and allegiance to their rightful czar. The response revealed how thoroughly Russia's elite had grown weary of Sophia's rule and eager for change. One by one, the Streltsy commanders who had once terrorized Peter's childhood abandoned the regent and pledged their loyalty to the young czar. The political revolution of 1689 was accomplished with remarkably little bloodshed. Sophia, abandoned by her supporters and faced with the prospect of civil war, chose exile in a convent rather than armed resistance. The dual monarchy ended with Ivan voluntarily relinquishing his claims to real power, content to retain the ceremonial aspects of czarship while leaving actual governance to his younger half-brother. But Peter's victory over the regency was only the beginning of his transformation of Russian society. The young Tsar who emerged from the crisis of 1689 was no longer the playful prince of Preobrazhenskoye but a determined ruler with a revolutionary vision for his empire's future. He had learned that power in Russia required not only legitimate authority but also the strength to overcome conservative resistance and the wisdom to build new institutions capable of sustaining change. Peter's first years of independent rule were marked by a systematic dismantling of traditional Russian governmental structures. The Boyar Duma, that ancient council of nobles that had advised Russian rulers for centuries, found its authority increasingly circumvented as Peter relied instead on informal advisors drawn from the foreign quarter and his military associates. The elaborate court ceremonies that had occupied so much time and energy in previous reigns were simplified or abandoned entirely, replaced by practical working sessions focused on specific administrative challenges. The new Tsar's approach to governance reflected his fundamental belief that Russia's survival depended on rapid modernization. Where previous rulers had viewed change as dangerous and potentially destabilizing, Peter saw tradition as the greatest threat to Russian security. The massive Ottoman Empire to the south, the Swedish Empire to the north, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west all possessed military and technological advantages that traditional Russian methods could not match. Peter's early military campaigns provided painful confirmation of Russia's backwardness. The Azov campaigns of 1695 and 1696, directed against Ottoman fortresses controlling access to the Black Sea, demonstrated both the young Tsar's strategic vision and the inadequacy of traditional Russian military methods. The first assault on Azov failed completely, with Russian forces unable to coordinate infantry attacks with artillery support or maintain effective sieges against modern fortifications. The lessons learned from this initial failure shaped Peter's approach to military reform. He recognized that effective modern warfare required not only new weapons and tactics but also fundamental changes in military organization, training, and logistics. The traditional Russian reliance on noble cavalry and Streltsy infantry had to be replaced with professional armies trained according to European standards and equipped with the latest military technology. But Peter also understood that military modernization alone would be insufficient to achieve his goals. Russia's technological and industrial base was too primitive to support modern military forces, while the country's administrative systems were inadequate for the complex tasks of governing an empire in an age of international competition. Comprehensive reform would require transforming not only Russia's military, but also its economy, education system, and social structure. The decision to undertake the Great Embassy emerged from Peter's recognition that he lacked the knowledge necessary to implement such comprehensive reforms. Despite his extensive contacts with foreign advisors and his studies in the foreign quarter, the young Tsar realized that he needed direct exposure to European society and technology to understand what Russia must become. The embassy would serve multiple purposes: diplomatic negotiations with European powers, recruitment of foreign specialists, and education of Russian officials in Western methods. The planning for the Great Embassy revealed Peter's characteristic attention to detail and his understanding of the symbolic importance of the mission. Rather than traveling as a reigning monarch surrounded by the elaborate ceremonial required for royal visits, Peter chose to join the embassy as a minor official using the assumed name Peter Mikhailov. This disguise would allow him to observe European society without the constraints of diplomatic protocol, while demonstrating to foreign observers Russia's commitment to learning from Western experience. The embassy that departed Moscow in March of 1697 consisted of over 250 officials, translators, guards, and servants, making it one of the largest diplomatic missions ever sent abroad by a Russian ruler. Led officially by Franz Lefort and including several experienced diplomats, the embassy carried instructions to negotiate military alliances against the Ottoman Empire while secretly pursuing Peter's educational objectives. The route through the German states provided Peter's first sustained exposure to Western European society. In Riga, then under Swedish control, he encountered the type of modern fortifications that had made Azov impregnable to traditional Russian assault. The young Tsar spent hours examining the city's defenses, sketching military engineering details and questioning local officials about construction techniques and garrison requirements. But it was in the Netherlands that Peter's education truly began in earnest. The Dutch Republic represented everything that Russia was not. A small country that had achieved great power status through maritime commerce, technological innovation, and efficient governance. Dutch cities amazed Peter with their prosperity and order, while Dutch shipyards demonstrated the industrial capacity that enabled a minor European state to maintain one of the world's largest merchant fleets. Peter's time in Amsterdam and the surrounding regions was spent in intensive study of shipbuilding techniques. Working alongside common laborers in the shipyards of the Dutch East India Company, the Tsar learned to use carpenter's tools, understand ship design, and appreciate the complex logistics required for maritime commerce. These experiences provided practical knowledge that would prove essential when he later created Russia's Baltic Fleet, but they also demonstrated the social and economic foundations required to support naval power. The Dutch phase of Peter's education extended beyond technical training to include exposure to European scientific and philosophical ideas. Through his contacts with leading Dutch intellectuals, including the anatomist Frederik Royce and the inventor Antony van Leeuwenhoek, Peter gained appreciation for empirical investigation and systematic experimentation. These encounters planted the seeds for the scientific institutions he would later establish in Russia. The embassy's visit to England provided Peter with exposure to a different model of European development. Where the Netherlands demonstrated the possibilities of commercial republicanism, England showed how traditional monarchy could adapt to modern requirements while maintaining social stability and military effectiveness. Peter's meetings with King William III revealed how European rulers balanced the demands of international competition with the need for domestic support. English shipyards and naval facilities provided Peter with advanced examples of military technology and organization. The Royal Navy's systematic approach to officer training, logistics, and strategic planning offered lessons that would later influence Russian naval development. English artillery foundries and small arms manufactories demonstrated industrial techniques that Russia would need to master to achieve military parity with European powers. But perhaps most importantly, Peter's English experiences exposed him to European approaches to education and intellectual development. Oxford and Cambridge universities, the Royal Society, and London's scientific community provided models for the educational institutions that Russia would need to sustain technological progress. The young Tsar began to understand that lasting reform required not only new technology but also new ways of thinking about knowledge and learning. The Great Embassy was cut short in July of 1698 by news of another Streltsy uprising in Moscow. The conservative military corps that had terrorized Peter's childhood had apparently concluded that the Tsar's extended absence provided an opportunity to restore traditional governance and eliminate foreign influence. The revolt was poorly planned and easily suppressed by forces loyal to Peter, but it demonstrated the continuing resistance to modernization among powerful elements of Russian society. Peter's response to the Streltsy rebellion revealed how profoundly his European experiences had changed his approach to governance. Rather than simply punishing the immediate participants, he used the uprising as justification for comprehensive military and administrative reforms that would eliminate traditional sources of opposition to modernization. The Streltsy Corps was disbanded entirely, its members dispersed throughout the empire or forced into exile. The investigation that followed the rebellion was conducted with a thoroughness and systematic brutality that shocked even Peter's supporters. Using torture and public executions, the Tsar sought not only to punish treason but also to terrorize potential opponents of reform. The sight of Peter personally wielding an executioner's axe sent a clear message that the new Russia would tolerate no compromise with the forces of reaction. But the suppression of the Streltsy rebellion was only one aspect of Peter's broader campaign to transform Russian society. Upon his return from Europe, the Tsar initiated a series of reforms that touched every aspect of traditional Russian life. The requirement that nobles shave their beards and adopt Western dress was perhaps the most visible symbol of change, but it reflected deeper transformations in social attitudes and cultural values. The beard tax imposed on those who wished to maintain traditional appearance was both a source of revenue and a tool of social engineering. By making traditional Orthodox appearance expensive while making Western fashion free, Peter created economic incentives for cultural change that proved more effective than simple prohibition. The measure demonstrated his understanding that lasting transformation required changing people's daily habits and social interactions, not merely their formal allegiances. The introduction of the Julian calendar, replacing the traditional Russian system that dated from the creation of the world, symbolized Peter's determination to align Russia with European civilization. The change required not only new methods of record-keeping but also fundamental alterations in how Russians understood their place in history and their relationship to the broader world. Educational reforms undertaken during this period laid the foundation for Russia's later intellectual development. The establishment of schools for navigation, artillery, and engineering provided the technical training necessary for military modernization, while new emphasis on foreign language instruction opened Russian minds to European ideas and methods. These institutions represented Peter's understanding that effective reform required creating new generations of Russians capable of thinking and working according to European standards. The economic policies implemented in the aftermath of the Great Embassy reflected Peter's exposure to European commercial practices and his understanding of the resources required for military modernization. New taxes on everything from bathhouses to horse collars generated revenue for military spending, while monopolies on salt, tobacco, and other commodities provided state income that could be invested in industrial development. The encouragement of foreign investment and immigration brought European capital and expertise to Russia while creating constituencies for continued modernization. Foreign merchants, artisans, and technicians who settled in Russian cities provided examples of European methods while training Russian workers in new techniques. These communities served as bridges between traditional Russian society and the modern world that Peter was determined to join. By the end of his first decade of independent rule, Peter had established the foundations for the comprehensive transformation of Russian society. The conservative forces that had dominated the Regency period had been eliminated or neutralized, while new institutions and policies had created momentum for continued change. The young Tsar, who had begun his reign as an isolated innovator, had become the leader of a modernizing movement that would reshape one of the world's largest empires. The stage was now set for the great test of Peter's reforms, the Northern War against Sweden, which would determine whether Russia's transformation had created sufficient strength to challenge the dominant European powers. The boy who had played with wooden cannons at Preobrazhenskoye was about to lead real armies against some of the most formidable military forces in European history. The Northern War begins. Trial by fire, 1700 to 1709. The war that would define Peter's reign and determine Russia's place in European politics began not with the thunder of cannons but with the careful scratching of quills on parchment. In August of 1700, Russia joined Denmark and Poland-Lithuania in an alliance against Sweden, launching what would become known as the Great Northern War. For Peter, this conflict represented the ultimate test of his reforms, the moment when Russian modernization would either prove sufficient to challenge European military supremacy or reveal itself as inadequate preparation for the realities of continental warfare. Sweden under King Charles XII represented everything that Peter aspired to achieve. Despite controlling a relatively small population, the Swedish Empire had become the dominant power in Northern Europe through military excellence, administrative efficiency, and strategic vision. Swedish armies were renowned throughout Europe for their discipline and tactical innovation, while Swedish administration had created governmental systems capable of mobilizing national resources for sustained military campaigns. Charles XII himself embodied the warrior king ideal that fascinated European imagination. Only 18 years old when the war began, he had already demonstrated the military genius and personal courage that would make him one of history's most celebrated commanders. Unlike Peter, who approached warfare as a technical and administrative challenge, Charles viewed combat as an expression of royal virtue and national character. The contrast between the two monarchs reflected deeper differences between their respective approaches to statecraft and military organization. Peter's reforms had emphasized systematic preparation, technological innovation, and the careful study of European methods. Charles relied instead on traditional Swedish military virtues: aggressive tactics, personal leadership, and the fighting spirit of armies that had dominated Northern European battlefields for generations. Peter's initial strategy reflected both his understanding of Swedish military superiority and his confidence in Russia's superior resources. Rather than seeking immediate decisive battles, the Russian plan called for coordinated attacks by all alliance members that would force Sweden to divide its forces among multiple theaters. Denmark would threaten Swedish possessions in southern Scandinavia, Poland would attack Swedish territories in the Baltic region, and Russia would assault Swedish fortresses controlling access to the Baltic Sea. The fortress of Narva, located on the border between Russian and Swedish territory, became Peter's primary objective in the war's opening phase. This massive stronghold controlled one of the few viable routes for Russian armies to reach the Baltic coast, while its capture would provide a symbolic demonstration of Russia's new military capabilities. The siege of Narva would serve as the first real test of Peter's military reforms and his army's ability to conduct modern warfare. The Russian force that assembled outside Narva in the autumn of 1700 represented Peter's attempt to create a European-style army from the raw materials of traditional Russian society. The new regiments trained according to European drill manuals and equipped with modern firearms numbered approximately 35,000 men, supported by artillery units and engineering specialists recruited from across Europe. Foreign officers provided technical expertise while Russian nobles commanded troops drawn from the empire's vast population. But the appearance of modernity could not disguise fundamental weaknesses in Russian military organization. The troops, while enthusiastic and numerous, lacked the experience that came from years of campaigning against European enemies. The officers, despite their formal training, had never commanded large formations in actual combat situations. Most critically, the complex logistics required to maintain modern armies in the field remained beyond Russian administrative capabilities. The siege of Narva quickly revealed these underlying problems. Russian artillery, though impressive in quantity, proved inadequate for reducing modern fortifications designed according to the latest European engineering principles. The coordination between different military branches that characterized successful European armies remained elusive, while supply problems forced Russian commanders to make tactical decisions based on logistical constraints rather than strategic considerations. Peter's personal role in the siege demonstrated both his commitment to learning military skills and his inexperience in actual combat operations. The Tsar insisted on participating directly in artillery bombardments and engineering work, exposing himself to enemy fire in ways that horrified his advisors while inspiring his soldiers. These experiences provided valuable lessons in the realities of warfare, but they also revealed how much Peter still had to learn about military leadership. The crisis that would determine the siege's outcome arrived in November when Charles XII appeared with a Swedish relief army. The young Swedish king had moved with characteristic speed and decisiveness, first crushing Danish resistance and forcing Denmark out of the war, then marching rapidly across the Baltic region to confront the Russian threat. His army, though outnumbered by nearly 3-1, possessed the training, experience, and leadership advantages that Peter's forces lacked. The Battle of Narva, fought on November 30, 1700, became one of the most humiliating defeats in Russian military history. Charles's assault, launched during a blinding snowstorm that concealed Swedish movements, shattered Russian formations that had never experienced the shock of professional European warfare. Panic spread through Russian ranks as units trained for parade ground maneuvers discovered their inadequacy for actual combat. The collapse of Russian resistance at Narva was both sudden and complete. Entire regiments fled without offering effective resistance, abandoning their artillery and baggage to pursuing Swedish cavalry. Foreign officers were captured or killed while Russian commanders struggled to maintain any semblance of military order. Peter himself barely escaped capture, forced to abandon his army and flee toward Moscow with only a small escort of loyal guards. The Swedish victory at Narva was so overwhelming that Charles dismissed Russia as a serious military threat, famously declaring that Peter was not dangerous to anyone. The Swedish king turned his attention to Poland, believing that Russia would require years to recover from the disaster and pose any meaningful challenge to Swedish dominance. This strategic miscalculation would prove to be one of the most significant errors in European military history. For Peter, the catastrophe at Narva represented both personal humiliation and strategic opportunity. The defeat demonstrated the inadequacy of his initial military reforms while simultaneously providing valuable lessons about the requirements for effective modern warfare. More importantly, Charles's decision to focus on Poland gave Russia the time necessary to rebuild its military forces according to the lessons learned from bitter experience. The transformation of the Russian military that followed Narva demonstrated Peter's remarkable ability to learn from failure and adapt his methods to changing circumstances. Rather than simply rebuilding the army that had been destroyed, he undertook fundamental reforms that addressed the systemic weaknesses revealed by the Swedish victory. The new military system that emerged from this process would prove capable not only of matching European armies but eventually of defeating the finest military forces of the age. The first priority was creating reliable sources of military equipment and supplies that would free Russia from dependence on foreign suppliers. New armaments factories established in the Urals and Central Russia began producing cannons, muskets, and ammunition according to the latest European specifications. These facilities, staffed by foreign technicians working alongside Russian apprentices, represented Peter's understanding that military independence required industrial self-sufficiency. The development of Russian metallurgy during this period achieved remarkable success in remarkably short time. The vast iron ore deposits of the Ural Mountains provided raw materials, while the region's forests supplied the charcoal necessary for smelting operations. New blast furnaces and forge complexes transformed Russia from a net importer of military hardware into one of Europe's largest producers of artillery and small arms. The reorganization of military training addressed the tactical deficiencies that had been so painfully exposed at Narva. New drill manuals based on European practice but adapted to Russian conditions emphasized coordination between different military branches and the systematic preparation required for siege warfare. Foreign instructors worked with Russian officers to develop training programs that could transform peasant recruits into disciplined soldiers capable of complex maneuvers. The creation of military academies provided long-term solutions to Russia's shortage of qualified officers. These institutions, modeled on European examples but designed for Russian needs, offered systematic instruction in mathematics, engineering, artillery, and foreign languages. The curriculum reflected Peter's understanding that modern warfare required not only courage and leadership but also technical knowledge and scientific understanding. The establishment of a regular recruitment system ensured that the new Russian army would have reliable access to manpower while distributing military service more equitably across society. The previous system of noble cavalry and professional streltsy units was replaced by standardized regiments recruited from all social classes according to systematic procedures. This innovation not only provided larger numbers of soldiers, but also created a more cohesive military culture that transcended traditional social divisions. While Peter rebuilt his military forces, Charles XII became increasingly entangled in the complex politics of Poland and Eastern Europe. The Swedish king's attempt to replace the elected Polish monarch with a more compliant candidate required sustained military intervention that tied down Swedish armies for years. This prolonged campaign provided Russia with the breathing space necessary to complete its military transformation while gradually wearing down Swedish resources and manpower. Peter used this respite to begin the systematic conquest of Swedish territories along the Baltic coast. Rather than attempting another direct assault on major fortresses, Russian forces adopted a strategy of gradual expansion that captured smaller strongholds while avoiding premature confrontation with main Swedish armies. These campaigns provided valuable combat experience for reformed Russian units while establishing secure bases for future operations. The capture of the fortress of Noteborg in October 1702 marked the beginning of Russia's successful offensive operations. This Swedish stronghold, located at the point where the Neva River flows out of Lake Ladoga, controlled access to the river system that connected the Baltic Sea with Russia's interior. The successful siege demonstrated that Russian forces had learned to coordinate artillery bombardments with infantry assaults while maintaining the supply lines necessary for extended operations. The victory at Noteborg, which Peter renamed Schlüsselburg or Key Castle, provided both strategic advantages and psychological benefits that would prove crucial for subsequent operations. Control of the fortress opened the Neva River to Russian navigation while demonstrating to European observers that Sweden's Baltic Empire was no longer impregnable. More importantly, the success gave Russian soldiers confidence in their ability to defeat Swedish forces in properly planned operations. The foundation of St. Petersburg in May 1703 represented the culmination of Peter's strategic vision and the beginning of his most ambitious construction project. The new city, built on islands at the mouth of the Neva River, would serve simultaneously as a naval base, commercial center, and symbol of Russia's transformation from a land-based empire into a maritime power. The location, captured from Sweden only months before, demonstrated Peter's confidence that Russian control of the Baltic region would prove permanent. The decision to build a major city in such an unpromising location reflected Peter's understanding that great achievements required accepting enormous risks and costs. The Neva Delta consisted largely of marshy islands subject to seasonal flooding, with a climate that challenged even experienced northern European settlers. The construction would require massive investments of labor and resources while exposing workers to disease, accident, and enemy attack. Yet Peter's vision extended beyond immediate practical considerations to encompass the symbolic and cultural significance of the new city. St. Petersburg would serve as Russia's window to Europe, a place where European ideas and methods could take root in Russian soil, while Russian achievements could be displayed to European observers. The city's architecture, planning, and social organization would demonstrate that Russia had successfully joined the community of European civilization. The initial construction of St. Petersburg required mobilizing resources on a scale unprecedented in Russian history. Tens of thousands of workers, including soldiers, peasants, and prisoners, were assembled from across the empire to clear swamps, drive foundations, and erect the first buildings. Foreign architects and engineers provided technical expertise while Russian overseers managed the vast workforce required for such an ambitious undertaking. The human cost of building Peter's new capital was enormous and would continue to mount throughout the construction process. Disease, accidents, and the harsh climate claimed thousands of lives each year, while the constant pressure to complete construction on schedule pushed workers beyond human endurance. Contemporary observers estimated that the city's foundations were literally built on the bones of those who died in its creation. But the strategic advantages provided by St. Petersburg justified these terrible costs in Peter's calculation. The new city controlled Russian access to the Baltic Sea while providing a base for the naval forces that would be essential for challenging Swedish maritime supremacy. The location also facilitated communication with European allies and commercial partners while demonstrating Russia's permanent commitment to Baltic expansion. The development of the Russian Baltic Fleet paralleled the construction of St. Petersburg and represented another crucial element in Peter's strategy for challenging Swedish power. The new navy, built in shipyards along the Neva River and manned by sailors trained according to European methods, would provide Russia with capabilities that no previous Russian ruler had possessed. Naval power would enable Russia to threaten Swedish communications, support amphibious operations, and project force throughout the Baltic region. The creation of a Russian navy from essentially nothing required solving technical, logistical, and human resource challenges that had defeated previous attempts at naval development. Shipyards had to be constructed and equipped with tools and materials suitable for building vessels capable of operating in Baltic conditions. Naval arsenals and supply depots provided the support systems necessary for maintaining fleets during extended campaigns. Most challenging of all, Russia had to develop the human resources required for effective naval operations. The recruitment and training of naval personnel presented particularly complex problems given Russia's lack of maritime traditions. Foreign officers and sailors provided initial expertise while Russian recruits learned seamanship through practical experience under combat conditions. The process was dangerous and expensive, with many early naval operations ending in disaster as inexperienced crews struggled to master the demanding skills required for effective naval warfare. By 1708, the combination of military, naval, and industrial reforms had transformed Russia into a formidable military power capable of challenging Sweden for control of the Baltic region. The army that had been humiliated at Narva had evolved into a professional force trained according to European standards and equipped with domestically produced weapons. The new navy, while still inexperienced, possessed sufficient strength to threaten Swedish control of Baltic sea lanes. The stage was now set for the decisive confrontation that would determine the war's outcome and establish Russia's status as a European great power. Charles XII, having finally resolved the Polish situation to his satisfaction, was preparing to turn his full attention to the Russian threat. The collision between Swedish military excellence and Russian reformed power would test whether Peter's comprehensive transformation of his empire had created sufficient strength to defeat one of Europe's most formidable military machines. Poltava. The decisive victory, 1708 to 1721. The year 1708 brought the climactic phase of the Great Northern War as Charles XII finally turned his full military attention toward Russia. The Swedish king, who had dismissed Peter as not dangerous to anyone, after Narva was about to discover how profoundly he had underestimated both his opponent and the transformation that 8 years of intensive reform had wrought in Russian military capabilities. The campaign that followed would culminate in one of the most decisive battles in European history and establish Russia as a great power capable of dictating terms to its neighbors. Charles's invasion of Russia began in January 1708 with an army that represented the finest military force in Northern Europe. Approximately 44,000 Swedish soldiers, veterans of campaigns across Poland and Germany, crossed into Russian territory with the confidence born of decades of unbroken victory. These troops, organized according to the latest European military principles and led by officers whose tactical expertise was renowned throughout the continent, seemed more than adequate to crush Russian resistance and dictate terms in Moscow itself. The Swedish strategy reflected Charles's characteristic boldness and his faith in the superiority of Swedish arms. Rather than attempting the gradual conquest of Russian border territories, the king planned a rapid advance on Moscow that would destroy Russian military forces in decisive battles and force Peter to accept Swedish terms. This approach had succeeded brilliantly in previous campaigns against Denmark and Poland, where swift victories had eliminated enemy resistance before Allied support could arrive. But the Russia that Charles invaded in 1708 was fundamentally different from the country that had suffered humiliation at Narva. 8 years of systematic reform had created military forces capable of meeting Swedish armies on equal terms, while the development of Russian industry had provided the weapons and supplies necessary for sustained resistance. Most importantly, Peter had learned from his early failures and developed strategic approaches that would turn Swedish military virtues into potential weaknesses. The Russian defensive strategy that unfolded during 1708 demonstrated Peter's growing sophistication as a military commander and his understanding of Russia's unique advantages in a prolonged conflict. Rather than seeking immediate battle with Swedish forces, Russian armies adopted scorched earth tactics that deprived the invaders of local supplies while forcing them to extend vulnerable communication lines deep into hostile territory. This approach required enormous self-discipline from Russian commanders who were eager to test their reformed forces against the legendary Swedish military machine. The systematic destruction of crops, livestock, and shelter that characterized Russian defensive operations imposed terrible hardships on the empire's own population while creating conditions that would gradually wear down Swedish strength. Entire regions were evacuated as their inhabitants fled eastward with their portable possessions, leaving behind empty villages and barren fields that could provide no sustenance for advancing armies. The psychological impact of this self-imposed devastation demonstrated Peter's ruthless determination to achieve victory regardless of immediate costs. Swedish forces advancing through this deliberately created wasteland found themselves facing challenges that their previous experience had not prepared them to meet. The abundance that had supported Swedish armies in Poland and Germany was replaced by systematic scarcity that forced constant attention to supply problems. Local populations, rather than accepting Swedish rule as a relief from Russian tyranny, proved hostile and uncooperative, providing intelligence to Russian forces while denying assistance to the invaders. The first major test of reformed Russian military capabilities came at the Battle of Lesnaya in September 1708. Where Peter personally commanded a force attempting to intercept Swedish supply convoys. The engagement provided crucial evidence that Russian troops could now hold their own against Swedish regulars in properly planned operations. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Swedish forces were no longer invincible and that sustained pressure could achieve results that direct confrontation had failed to produce. The winter of 1708 to 1709 proved to be one of the harshest in European memory, with temperatures dropping to levels that challenged even experienced Northern European armies. Swedish forces, scattered across hostile territory and dependent on increasingly precarious supply lines, suffered enormous casualties from cold, disease, and malnutrition. The army that had entered Russia with such confidence found itself reduced by nearly half before engaging in any major battles. Charles's decision to turn southward toward Ukraine in the spring of 1709 reflected both strategic necessity and tactical opportunity. The Swedish king hoped to find in Ukrainian territories the supplies and local support that had proven unavailable in central Russia, while potentially gaining the alliance of Cossack forces under their hetman Ivan Mazepa. This strategic pivot would bring Swedish forces into the region around Poltava, where the decisive battle of the entire war would finally occur. The Ukrainian campaign that unfolded during the spring of 1709 revealed both the possibilities and limitations of Charles's strategic vision. Mazepa's support provided some local assistance and demonstrated that not all of Peter's subjects were loyal to his modernizing regime. But the Cossack alliance also created new complications for Swedish forces, as traditional Cossack military methods proved incompatible with European tactical systems, while Cossack political goals diverged from Swedish strategic objectives. Peter's response to the Swedish move into Ukraine demonstrated the strategic patience and tactical flexibility that he had developed through years of military education. Rather than rushing to defend Ukrainian territories, the Tsar continued to avoid premature battle while building up the forces that would be necessary for decisive confrontation. The Russian army that gradually assembled in the Poltava region represented the culmination of a decade of military reform and the full mobilization of the empire's military potential. The siege of Poltava that began in April 1709 provided the strategic context for the climactic battle that would determine the war's outcome. The fortress, while not particularly formidable by European standards, controlled important river crossings and supply routes that both armies needed to continue their campaigns. Charles's decision to besiege the town reflected his need for a base of operations in hostile territory, while Peter's determination to relieve the siege created the conditions for the direct confrontation that both sides had been approaching for months. The battle lines that formed around Poltava in June 1709 represented more than a simple military confrontation between two armies. The engagement would test whether European military supremacy could be successfully challenged by a modernizing empire willing to adapt foreign methods to its own purposes. The outcome would determine not only the immediate fate of the Great Northern War, but also the future balance of power in Eastern Europe and Russia's place in the international system. Peter's army that prepared for battle at Poltava numbered approximately 45,000 men, roughly equal to Swedish strength but vastly superior in artillery and supply arrangements. The Russian forces were organized according to European military principles but adapted to local conditions and combat experience gained through years of campaigning. Foreign officers provided technical expertise while Russian commanders contributed knowledge of local terrain and enemy capabilities. The Swedish army that Charles led into battle on the morning of July 8, 1709, represented the last great effort of a military system that had dominated Northern European warfare for generations. Despite the losses suffered during the winter campaign, Swedish forces retained the discipline, tactical expertise, and fighting spirit that had made them feared throughout Europe. The presence of Charles himself, wounded but determined to lead his troops personally, provided inspiration that compensated for material disadvantages. The Battle of Poltava began with a Swedish assault on Russian fortifications that initially seemed to confirm the superiority of Swedish tactical methods. Charles's infantry, advancing in disciplined formations despite artillery fire, broke through Russian forward positions and captured several redoubts. For a brief moment, it appeared that Swedish military excellence would once again triumph over superior numbers and defensive advantages. But the reformed Russian army that met the Swedish assault was fundamentally different from the force that had collapsed at Narva 9 years earlier. Russian troops held their positions under fire, conducted orderly withdrawals when necessary, and maintained unit cohesion even during the most intense fighting. The systematic training and professional leadership that Peter had insisted upon proved their worth as Russian forces demonstrated that they could match Swedish discipline and tactical skill. The decisive moment came when Swedish forces, having achieved initial success, found themselves unable to exploit their advantages due to casualties, exhaustion, and the breakdown of command coordination. Charles himself was wounded early in the battle and forced to delegate tactical command to subordinates who lacked his genius for battlefield improvisation. Without the king's personal leadership, Swedish attacks lost their characteristic momentum and began to stall against determined Russian resistance. Peter's personal role in the battle demonstrated how completely he had mastered the military skills that had seemed so elusive during his early campaigns. The Tsar moved throughout the battlefield, coordinating the actions of different military units while maintaining his personal composure under fire. His presence inspired Russian troops while his tactical decisions reflected the military education that he had pursued so systematically since the disaster at Narva. The collapse of Swedish resistance at Poltava was as sudden and complete as the Russian defeat had been at Narva, but this time the roles were reversed. Swedish formations that had begun the day with confidence in their superiority found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed by Russian forces that seemed to have absorbed the best elements of European military practice while retaining distinctly Russian advantages in numbers and determination. Charles's escape from the battlefield with only a small escort of loyal cavalry marked the end of Swedish military supremacy in Eastern Europe and the beginning of Russia's emergence as a great power. The Swedish army that had dominated Northern European warfare for generations was effectively destroyed, with most of its officers and men killed or captured. The king, who had dismissed Peter as not dangerous to anyone, was forced to seek refuge in Ottoman territory, effectively eliminating Swedish influence from the region. The immediate aftermath of Poltava revealed the broader implications of Russian victory for the European balance of power. The destruction of Swedish military might create opportunities for other powers to settle old scores and pursue territorial ambitions that had been frustrated by Swedish strength. Denmark re-entered the war to reclaim territories lost in previous conflicts, while Poland sought to reassert its influence in regions that had fallen under Swedish control. But it was Russia that gained the most from the transformation of the strategic situation. Peter's victory at Poltava established his empire as the dominant power in Eastern Europe while demonstrating that European military methods could be successfully adapted to Russian purposes. The battle marked Russia's definitive entry into the community of European great powers and the beginning of its role as a major factor in continental politics. The naval victories that followed Poltava confirmed Russia's emergence as a Baltic power capable of challenging traditional maritime supremacy. The Battle of Hango in 1714, where Russian naval forces defeated a Swedish fleet and demonstrated the effectiveness of Peter's naval reforms, marked the first time that Russian ships had prevailed against European naval forces in open combat. The victory provided dramatic evidence that Russia's transformation extended beyond land warfare to encompass all aspects of military power. The systematic conquest of Swedish Baltic territories that characterized the war's final phase demonstrated Russia's ability to conduct sustained military operations while maintaining the diplomatic and logistical support necessary for successful campaigns. Russian forces captured fortress after fortress, island after island, gradually eliminating Swedish presence from the eastern Baltic while establishing permanent Russian control over territories that would remain part of the empire for centuries. The Peace of Nystad, signed in 1721, formally confirmed the transformation of the European balance of power that had been achieved through Russian military success. Sweden ceded to Russia the provinces of Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and part of Karelia, providing the empire with secure access to the Baltic Sea and permanent bases for naval operations. The territorial gains represented not only strategic advantages but also symbolic recognition of Russia's status as a European great power. Peter's assumption of the title emperor following the peace settlement reflected both his personal ambitions and the broader transformation that his reign had accomplished. The Muscovite Tsardom that had begun the century as a backward and isolated monarchy had been transformed into the Russian Empire, a modernized state capable of competing with any European power. The boy who had played with toy soldiers at Preobrazhenskoye had become the ruler of one of the world's largest and most powerful empires. The celebration of victory that followed the Peace of Nystad demonstrated the extent to which Russian society had been transformed by 2 decades of intensive reform. The festivities, conducted according to European customs and featuring displays of military technology and artistic achievement, showed that Russia had successfully adopted the cultural as well as military practices that characterized European civilization. The country that had once seemed hopelessly backward had joined the ranks of modern nations. But the costs of Peter's transformation were as enormous as its achievements. The human price paid for military victory and social modernization included hundreds of thousands of deaths from warfare, disease, and the brutal conditions imposed by accelerated development. Entire regions had been devastated by scorched earth tactics, while traditional ways of life had been disrupted or destroyed by administrative and social reforms. The economic burden of sustained warfare and rapid modernization had strained even Russia's vast resources to their limits. New taxes, forced labor, and state monopolies had generated the revenues necessary for military success, while creating hardships that fell most heavily on the empire's peasant population. The prosperity and power that Peter's reforms had created rested on foundations of suffering that would influence Russian development for generations. Yet the magnitude of Peter's achievement remained undeniable. In the space of 2 decades, he had transformed a medieval kingdom into a modern empire capable of defeating the finest military forces in Europe. The victory at Poltava and the subsequent conquest of Baltic territories had established Russia as a great power while demonstrating that determined leadership and systematic reform could overcome even the most daunting disadvantages. St. Petersburg, window to Europe and cultural revolution, 1703 to 1725. The city that would become Peter's greatest monument and Russia's most audacious architectural achievement began as little more than a collection of wooden huts scattered across marshy islands where the Neva River met the Baltic Sea. The transformation of this unpromising wilderness into one of Europe's most magnificent capitals represented not only an extraordinary feat of engineering and urban planning, but also the physical embodiment of Peter's vision for Russia's cultural and political transformation. St. Petersburg would serve simultaneously as fortress, seaport, administrative center, and symbol, a window to Europe that demonstrated Russia's permanent commitment to joining the community of European civilization. The strategic reasoning behind Peter's decision to establish a new capital in such an unlikely location reflected his understanding that lasting change required dramatic gestures capable of breaking the psychological hold of tradition. Moscow, with its ancient Kremlin and labyrinthine streets, represented everything that Peter sought to transform about Russian society. The old capital's architecture embodied centuries of Orthodox tradition and Mongol influence, while its social organization perpetuated the hierarchies and customs that Peter viewed as obstacles to modernization. St. Petersburg, by contrast, would be built according to European principles of urban planning and architectural design. The new city would demonstrate that Russia could not only adopt European methods but surpass European achievements in scale and ambition. Every aspect of the city's development, from its geometric street layout to its classical facades, would serve as propaganda for the superiority of Western civilization and the necessity of Russian transformation. The initial construction of St. Petersburg required mobilizing human and material resources on a scale unprecedented in Russian history. The workforce that assembled in the Neva Delta during the summer of 1703 included soldiers from Peter's reformed regiments, peasants conscripted from across the empire, Swedish prisoners of war, and skilled craftsmen recruited from European cities. This diverse assembly of laborers, speaking dozens of languages and representing vastly different cultural traditions, reflected the cosmopolitan character that Peter intended his new capital to embody. The challenges posed by the site Peter had chosen for his city seemed almost insurmountable to contemporary observers. The Neva Delta consisted largely of swampland subject to seasonal flooding, with a foundation of soft clay and peat that could barely support substantial construction. The climate, with its long winters and brief summers, challenged workers accustomed to more temperate conditions, while the marshy environment bred diseases that claimed thousands of lives each construction season. Yet these apparent disadvantages also offered unique opportunities for creating a city unlike any other in the world. The network of rivers and canals that characterized St. Petersburg's geography was partially natural but largely artificial, created through massive engineering projects that diverted water flow and drained marshland. The resulting urban landscape, with its combination of waterways and classical architecture, would create visual effects reminiscent of Venice while serving the practical purposes of transportation and defense. The engineering challenges of building on such unstable foundations required innovations that pushed contemporary construction technology to its limits. Deep pilings driven into the marshy soil provided the stable foundations necessary for substantial buildings, while sophisticated drainage systems prevented water damage and maintained structural integrity. The techniques developed for St. Petersburg's construction would later influence urban development throughout the Russian Empire and demonstrate the empire's growing technological capabilities. Peter's personal involvement in every aspect of the city's planning and construction reflected both his hands-on approach to leadership and his understanding of the symbolic importance of the project. The emperor personally surveyed building sites, approved architectural plans, and inspected construction progress with attention to detail that amazed foreign observers. His frequent presence on construction sites, working alongside common laborers and consulting with master craftsmen, demonstrated the democratic spirit that he hoped would characterize Russian society. The architectural vision that guided St. Petersburg's development represented a conscious rejection of traditional Russian building styles in favor of European classicism. The Baroque and Rococo elements that dominated the city's most important buildings reflected Peter's exposure to Dutch and German architecture during the Great Embassy, while the overall urban plan followed geometric principles derived from French examples. The result was a built environment that seemed to transport visitors from the Russian countryside directly into the heart of European civilization. The Winter Palace, begun during Peter's reign but completed after his death, exemplified the architectural ambitions that drove the city's development. This massive structure, stretching for over 200 meters along the Neva embankment, combined residential, ceremonial, and administrative functions within a building that rivaled the greatest palaces of Western Europe. The palace's green and white facade, punctuated by hundreds of windows and crowned with elaborate decorative elements, created visual impact that proclaimed Russia's equality with the most sophisticated European courts. The Petropavlovsk Fortress, the city's original nucleus and Peter's first major construction project, served both military and symbolic functions that reflected the dual nature of Russian modernization. The fortress's bastioned walls and artillery positions provided essential defense against potential Swedish attacks, while its geometrically perfect star-shaped plan demonstrated Russia's mastery of the latest European fortification techniques. The fortress's cathedral, with its soaring spire topped by a golden angel, created a vertical landmark that could be seen throughout the city while housing the tombs of Russian emperors. The development of St. Petersburg's residential architecture reflected Peter's broader social reforms and his determination to create new forms of community life. The wooden houses that characterized the city's early years gradually gave way to stone and brick construction as the population grew and prospered. Building codes established by imperial decree required conformity to European architectural standards while mandating construction techniques that would create a unified urban appearance. The social engineering aspects of St. Petersburg's development were as ambitious as its physical construction. Peter's decision to relocate the court and government administration from Moscow to the new capital forced thousands of nobles, officials, and merchants to abandon their traditional residences and adapt to new ways of living. This massive population transfer disrupted established social networks while creating opportunities for new forms of cultural interaction and political organization. The foreign communities that established themselves in St. Petersburg during its early years provided models for the European lifestyle that Peter hoped Russian society would adopt. Dutch merchants, German craftsmen, Italian architects, and French teachers brought with them not only technical skills but also social customs, educational methods, and cultural practices that gradually influenced Russian behavior. The integration of these foreign populations into the city's social fabric created a cosmopolitan atmosphere unlike anything previously seen in Russian history. The educational institutions established in St. Petersburg reflected Peter's understanding that lasting cultural change required systematic instruction in European knowledge and methods. The Naval Academy, founded in 1715, provided technical training for naval officers while introducing Russian students to mathematics, geography, and foreign languages. The Academy of Sciences, planned during Peter's lifetime but established after his death, would become one of Europe's leading centers for scientific research and intellectual exchange. The cultural life that developed in St. Petersburg during Peter's reign represented a fundamental break with traditional Russian customs and practices. European-style social gatherings, featuring mixed company of men and women, replaced the segregated entertainments that had characterized Muscovite court life. Dancing, card games, and theatrical performances introduced forms of recreation that emphasized social interaction and cultural sophistication rather than religious observance or traditional ceremony. The assemblies that Peter mandated for St. Petersburg society served both social and political purposes by creating new frameworks for interaction between different social classes and cultural groups. These gatherings, held in private homes according to a rotating schedule, required hosts to provide entertainment and refreshments while guests participated in conversations that ranged across topics that would have been inappropriate in traditional Russian social settings. The assemblies created spaces where European ideas could circulate freely while gradually transforming Russian attitudes toward authority, social hierarchy, and cultural expression. The economic development that accompanied St. Petersburg's physical growth demonstrated the city's success in attracting international commerce and establishing Russia as a participant in European trade networks. The port facilities constructed along the Neva River could accommodate the largest merchant vessels of the period, while warehouses and commercial buildings provided the infrastructure necessary for handling the goods that flowed between Russia and Western Europe. The customs revenues generated by this commerce helped finance the city's continued expansion while providing evidence of its economic viability. The transformation of Russian court culture that occurred with the move to St. Petersburg represented one of Peter's most significant social achievements. The elaborate ceremonial that had characterized life in the Moscow Kremlin was replaced by more informal protocols that emphasized efficiency and accessibility rather than ancient tradition. Foreign diplomats and visitors found themselves dealing with court officials who spoke European languages, understood international customs, and conducted business according to practices familiar throughout European capitals. The religious innovations that Peter introduced in St. Petersburg reflected his broader campaign to modernize Orthodox Christianity and align it with European Protestant practices. The city's churches, while maintaining Orthodox liturgy and doctrine, adopted architectural styles that emphasized light, space, and rational organization rather than the mystical atmosphere traditional in Russian religious architecture. The clergy who served these congregations received education that included secular subjects alongside theological training, creating a more worldly and intellectually sophisticated religious leadership. The industrial development that occurred in and around St. Petersburg during Peter's reign provided the economic foundation for the city's continued growth, while demonstrating Russia's capacity for large-scale manufacturing. Shipyards along the Neva River produced vessels for both military and commercial use, while textile factories supplied cloth for the growing population. Iron foundries and armaments factories provided the weapons and tools necessary for continued military campaigns while establishing St. Petersburg as a center for heavy industry. The artistic and cultural institutions that emerged in St. Petersburg during its early years reflected Peter's determination to compete with European capitals in all aspects of civilized life. The first Russian newspaper, published in St. Petersburg beginning in 1703, provided residents with news from across Europe while promoting literacy and political awareness. Libraries and museums collected books and artifacts that preserved both European culture and Russian achievements, creating repositories of knowledge that supported the city's intellectual development. The architectural competitions and urban planning projects that shaped St. Petersburg's continued development demonstrated Peter's commitment to creating a city that would surpass European models rather than merely imitate them. Foreign architects invited to submit designs for major buildings found themselves competing not only with each other but also with Russian designers who had absorbed European techniques while developing distinctively Russian approaches to architectural problems. The resulting built environment combined international sophistication with local innovation in ways that created a uniquely Russian form of European civilization. The transportation infrastructure that connected St. Petersburg to the rest of the Russian Empire required engineering projects that rivaled the city's construction in scale and ambition. The system of canals, roads, and eventually railroads that linked the new capital to Moscow, the Volga River system, and other major population centers enabled the rapid movement of goods, people, and information that was essential for effective imperial administration. These transportation networks also facilitated the spread of European ideas and practices from St. Petersburg throughout the empire. The military installations that surrounded St. Petersburg provided essential defense for the new capital while serving as training centers for the reformed Russian military. The fortress of Kronstadt, built on an island in the Gulf of Finland, protected the approaches to the city while providing a base for naval operations throughout the Baltic region. Army barracks and training facilities on the mainland housed the regiments that served as both garrison forces and laboratories for military innovation. The diplomatic and international activities centered in St. Petersburg established the city as one of Europe's major political centers within decades of its founding. Foreign embassies constructed elaborate residences that competed with imperial palaces in magnificence, while international conferences and negotiations conducted in the city determined the fate of European politics. The presence of these diplomatic missions provided Russian officials with direct access to European political developments while offering foreign observers intimate knowledge of Russian policies and capabilities. The scientific and technological innovations that emerged from St. Petersburg during Peter's reign demonstrated the city's success in fostering the intellectual creativity that Peter viewed as essential for continued progress. The instrument makers, cartographers, and natural philosophers who established themselves in the city created new knowledge while adapting European scientific methods to Russian conditions. The Academy of Sciences, though formally established after Peter's death, built upon foundations laid during his reign and reflected his vision of Russia as a contributor to rather than merely a consumer of European learning. The social transformations that occurred in St. Petersburg during its first decades created new forms of identity and community that would influence Russian development for centuries. The city's residents, drawn from across the empire and beyond, developed loyalties and customs that transcended traditional regional and ethnic boundaries while maintaining connections to their diverse origins. This cosmopolitan urban culture provided a model for the imperial identity that would characterize Russian civilization throughout the modern period. By the end of Peter's reign, St. Petersburg had become more than simply a new capital or even a symbol of Russian modernization. The city represented a successful demonstration that European civilization could be transplanted to Russian soil while adapting to local conditions and requirements. Its existence proved that Russia possessed the resources, determination, and creativity necessary to compete with any European power on equal terms while maintaining its distinctive character and traditions. The final years, empire consolidated and legacy defined, 1721 to 1725. The emperor who celebrated the Peace of Nystad in 1721 was a fundamentally different man from the restless young Tsar who had fled the Streltsy uprising 4 decades earlier. Peter's body bore the scars of countless campaigns and construction projects. His hands were calloused from working alongside common laborers, and his face showed the strain of transforming an entire empire through sheer force of will. Yet at 59 years of age, the architect of modern Russia remained as energetic and visionary as ever, determined to complete the transformation he had begun and ensure its survival beyond his own lifetime. The proclamation of the Russian Empire in 1721 represented more than a change in official titles. It marked the formal recognition of what Peter's reforms had already accomplished in practice. The medieval Muscovite Tsardom, with its inward-looking religious culture and administrative systems inherited from Mongol overlords, had been replaced by a European-style empire capable of projecting power across continents and competing with any nation on earth. The new title emperor placed Peter on equal footing with the Habsburg rulers of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire while asserting Russia's status as a great power that demanded respect from all European courts. The administrative reforms that Peter implemented during his final years reflected decades of experience in governance and his determination to create institutional frameworks that could function effectively without his personal oversight. The Table of Ranks, promulgated in 1722, represented perhaps his most far-reaching social innovation by establishing a meritocratic system that replaced traditional hereditary privilege with advancement based on service and competence. This revolutionary concept fundamentally altered Russian society by creating opportunities for talented individuals from modest backgrounds while requiring the nobility to earn their positions through actual achievement. The Table of Ranks established 14 grades of service in military, civil, and court hierarchies, with advancement dependent on demonstrated competence rather than family connections or ancient bloodlines. Officers and officials who distinguished themselves in service could rise through the ranks regardless of their social origins, while those who failed to perform effectively found their traditional privileges meaningless. The system created powerful incentives for education, professional development, and loyal service while breaking down the barriers that had previously separated different social classes. The Senate, established as the supreme administrative body for the empire, provided institutional continuity that would enable effective governance during imperial absences or transitions between rulers. Unlike the ancient Boyar Duma, which had represented traditional noble families and regional interests, the Senate consisted of appointed officials responsible for implementing imperial policies and coordinating the activities of various governmental departments. The body's systematic approach to record-keeping, policy implementation, and administrative oversight created governmental efficiency that surpassed most European states. The collegial system introduced during Peter's final years replaced the chaotic network of traditional Russian administrative offices with rationalized departments modeled on Swedish and Prussian examples. Each college had clearly defined responsibilities and standardized procedures, while the collective decision-making process reduced the potential for corruption and arbitrary actions. The War College, Admiralty College, Foreign Affairs College, and other specialized bodies created expertise and institutional memory that enhanced the empire's administrative capabilities. The legal reforms that accompanied these administrative changes reflected Peter's understanding that modern governance required systematic approaches to justice and law enforcement. The General Regulation of 1720 established uniform procedures for government operations, while the Military Regulation created disciplinary codes that applied equally to all ranks. These legal innovations, combined with Peter's earlier efforts to codify civil and criminal law, provided the empire with coherent legal frameworks that supported both individual rights and state authority. The educational institutions that Peter established during his final years represented his most important investment in Russia's future development. The Academy of Sciences, formally chartered in 1724 but planned for several years earlier, would become one of Europe's leading centers for scientific research and intellectual exchange. The Academy's international faculty, recruited from across Europe, brought the latest developments in mathematics, astronomy, natural philosophy, and other disciplines to Russian students while conducting original research that advanced human knowledge. The engineering and technical schools that multiplied throughout the empire during this period provided the trained personnel necessary for continued industrial and military development. The Naval Academy in St. Petersburg produced officers capable of commanding the world's most sophisticated warships, while artillery schools trained specialists in the increasingly complex science of ballistics and fortification. Mining and metallurgical institutes developed the expertise necessary for exploiting Russia's vast mineral resources, while agricultural schools promoted improved farming techniques that could support the empire's growing population. The industrial policies that Peter pursued during his final years built upon the foundations established during the Great Northern War while expanding Russia's manufacturing capacity to meet peacetime needs. State-sponsored factories produced textiles, iron goods, and luxury items that reduced dependence on foreign imports while generating export revenues. The proto-industrial system that emerged combined traditional craft production with innovative manufacturing techniques, creating economic foundations that would support continued imperial expansion. The mining and metallurgical industries that developed in the Ural Mountains during this period transformed Russia into one of Europe's largest producers of iron and other metals. The blast furnaces and forges established under state supervision employed thousands of workers while producing raw materials that supplied both domestic consumption and international trade. The revenues generated by these industries provided the financial resources necessary for maintaining military forces and funding continued development projects. The commercial policies that Peter implemented during his final years reflected his understanding of international trade as both an economic opportunity and a tool of diplomatic influence. The port facilities developed in St. Petersburg, Archangel, and other coastal cities handled increasing volumes of goods, while demonstrating Russia's integration into European commercial networks. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency facilitated trade relationships, while the development of banking and credit systems enabled more sophisticated commercial transactions. The exploration and territorial expansion that continued throughout Peter's reign extended Russian influence into previously unknown regions, while demonstrating the empire's capacity for sustained growth. The expeditions to Central Asia, Siberia, and the Pacific coast established Russian presence in areas that would become crucial for future development while providing scientific knowledge about geography, natural resources, and indigenous populations. These exploratory missions reflected Peter's vision of Russia as a transcontinental empire capable of connecting European and Asian civilizations. The Great Northern Expedition, planned during Peter's final years but executed after his death, represented the culmination of his geographical ambitions and scientific curiosity. This massive undertaking, involving thousands of participants over more than a decade, would map the entire northern coast of Asia while conducting systematic scientific observations that advanced understanding of Arctic geography and navigation. The expedition demonstrated Russia's emergence as a major contributor to European scientific knowledge while establishing territorial claims that extended imperial boundaries to their natural limits. The diplomatic relationships that Peter cultivated during his final years reflected Russia's new status as a European great power capable of influencing continental politics. The alliance systems and international agreements that emerged from Russian negotiations demonstrated the empire's ability to balance competing interests while pursuing its own strategic objectives. The marriage alliances arranged between Russian imperial family members and European royalty created dynastic connections that reinforced diplomatic relationships while demonstrating Russia's acceptance into the community of European sovereign houses. The cultural and artistic developments that flourished during Peter's final years reflected the success of his efforts to establish Russia as a center of European civilization. The architectural projects completed in St. Petersburg and other major cities created built environments that rivaled the greatest achievements of Western Europe while adapting European styles to Russian conditions. The literary and musical traditions that emerged during this period combined European forms with Russian content, creating distinctive cultural expressions that influenced artistic development throughout the empire. The religious reforms that Peter implemented during his final years completed his transformation of the Orthodox Church into an institution that supported rather than hindered imperial modernization. The Holy Synod, established in 1721 to replace the traditional patriarchate, brought church administration under state control while maintaining theological independence. This arrangement eliminated the potential for religious opposition to governmental policies while preserving the spiritual authority that provided social cohesion throughout the empire. The educational requirements imposed on Orthodox clergy ensured that religious leaders possessed the knowledge necessary for effective service in a modernizing society. Seminary training that included secular subjects alongside theological instruction produced priests capable of serving as teachers, administrators, and community leaders in regions where other educated personnel were unavailable. The translation of religious texts into vernacular languages, while maintaining Church Slavonic for liturgical purposes, made Orthodox Christianity more accessible to ordinary believers while preserving traditional forms of worship. The social and cultural transformation that characterized Russian society during Peter's final years demonstrated the success of his comprehensive reform program. The European dress, customs, and educational practices that had seemed so alien to Russian traditions during the early years of his reign had become accepted parts of elite culture while gradually influencing broader social practices. The assemblies, theaters, and social gatherings that created new forms of community life had established patterns of interaction that would influence Russian society for centuries. The economic prosperity that characterized the empire during Peter's final years provided evidence of his reforms' practical success while creating resources for continued development. Agricultural productivity increased through improved techniques and expanded cultivation, while industrial production grew to meet both domestic needs and export demands. The population growth that occurred throughout the empire during this period reflected improved living conditions and economic opportunities, while providing the human resources necessary for continued expansion. The military reforms that Peter completed during his final years created armed forces that could maintain the empire's security while projecting power throughout Europe and Asia. The professional officer corps educated in specialized academies possessed technical knowledge and leadership skills that exceeded most European standards, while the enlisted forces recruited through systematic conscription provided reliable manpower for extended campaigns. The naval forces that Peter had created from nothing had become one of Europe's most formidable fleets, capable of challenging any power for control of the Baltic Sea. The legal and administrative innovations that Peter implemented during his final years provided institutional frameworks that would enable effective governance long after his death. The systematic approach to record-keeping, policy implementation, and administrative oversight that characterized the reformed government created efficiency and predictability that supported economic development while maintaining social order. The merit-based advancement systems that replaced traditional privilege with demonstrated competence encouraged education and professional development while creating incentives for loyal service. The succession crisis that emerged during Peter's final illness reflected both the success and the limitations of his reform program. The absence of clear succession laws, combined with the premature death of his designated heir Alexei, created uncertainties about the empire's future leadership that threatened to undermine the stability that Peter had worked so hard to achieve. The emperor's inability to resolve this fundamental constitutional question demonstrated that even the most comprehensive reforms could not address every challenge facing a modernizing society. The personal toll that Peter's relentless drive for transformation had exacted became increasingly apparent during his final years. The emperor, who had worked alongside common laborers, led armies in battle, and personally supervised countless construction projects, had pushed his body beyond human endurance in service of his imperial vision. The illnesses and injuries that accumulated over decades of intense activity gradually weakened the physical constitution that had enabled such extraordinary achievements. Yet even as his health declined, Peter continued to pursue new projects and reforms with characteristic energy and determination. The plans for educational expansion, industrial development, and territorial exploration that occupied his final months demonstrated his continuing faith in Russia's potential for greatness. The detailed instructions that he prepared for his successors reflected his understanding that lasting achievement required institutional frameworks capable of functioning beyond any individual's lifetime. The death of Peter the Great on February 8, 1725, marked the end of an era that had transformed not only Russia but the entire balance of European power. The emperor, who had inherited a medieval kingdom isolated from European civilization, left behind a modern empire capable of competing with any nation on earth. The boy who had played with toy soldiers in the village of Preobrazhenskoye had become the architect of a military machine that dominated Eastern Europe while projecting power across 3 continents. The immediate aftermath of Peter's death revealed both the strength and the fragility of the system he had created. The institutional frameworks that he had established proved capable of maintaining governmental continuity and administrative effectiveness, while the military forces that he had reformed remained loyal and disciplined. Yet the succession struggles that followed demonstrated that the empire's stability ultimately depended on leadership capable of continuing the modernization process that Peter had initiated. The legacy that Peter left to Russia and to world history extended far beyond the territorial gains and military victories that marked his reign. His demonstration that systematic reform could transform even the most backward society provided a model for modernization that would influence development throughout Europe and beyond. The institutions that he created, the cities that he built, and the cultural transformations that he initiated continued to shape Russian civilization long after his death. The European recognition of Russia as a great power that Peter achieved through military success and diplomatic skill permanently altered the continental balance of power while establishing patterns of international relations that would persist for centuries. The technological and scientific innovations that he promoted enhanced human knowledge while demonstrating that intellectual progress required systematic investment and international cooperation. The administrative and legal reforms that he implemented provided governmental efficiency and social order that supported economic development and cultural achievement. The personal example that Peter provided of leadership dedicated to national transformation inspired future generations of reformers while demonstrating the possibilities for individual achievement in service of collective goals. His willingness to learn from foreign examples while adapting them to local conditions showed that successful modernization required both openness to change and respect for existing institutions. His combination of visionary planning with practical implementation demonstrated that lasting reform required both theoretical understanding and hands-on experience. The empire that Peter created through 5 decades of relentless effort had become one of the world's major powers while retaining its distinctive character and cultural identity. The Russian civilization that emerged from his reign combined European sophistication with indigenous traditions, creating a unique synthesis that would influence global development for centuries. The transformation that he accomplished provided proof that human determination and systematic effort could overcome even the most daunting obstacles while achieving seemingly impossible goals. The sound of bells echoing across St. Petersburg on the morning of Peter's death marked not only the end of an extraordinary life, but also the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The emperor who had dreamed of ships in the West while born in the towers of the old Kremlin had succeeded in making those dreams reality. To make Russia great, he had indeed broken it, then rebuilt it anew. His greatest monument was not any single building or battlefield victory, but the transformation of an entire civilization and the demonstration that human will, properly directed, could reshape the world itself. In the gentle lapping of Baltic waves against the granite embankments of St. Petersburg, in the whisper of wind through the rigging of ships that sail under the Russian flag across all the world's oceans, in the turning of pages in schools and universities from Moscow to Vladivostok, the legacy of Peter the Great continues. The boy who refused to sit quietly on a throne had taught an empire to dream of horizons beyond any single lifetime, and in that teaching, perhaps, lay his truest greatness.